I was finally getting the validation I craved at my new position when I met Derek. Marcus had been so consumed with his own professional security that he barely acknowledged how much I'd given up relocating to this unfamiliar city with him. I'd abandoned my entire friend group, my beloved local haunts, the existence I'd carefully constructed for myself, all so he could have his precious career advancement. And what did I receive in exchange? A husband who operated from home in sweatpants and considered a romantic gesture ordering takeout from somewhere different than our regular spot. Derek was completely different from the instant I stepped into that workplace. He actually made eye contact when I introduced myself, actually grinned like he was genuinely curious about knowing me. During my initial week, when I expressed how challenging it was adapting to a new location, he didn't just acknowledge and shift topics like Marcus would have. He posed follow-up inquiries, wanted to discover what I yearned for most about my previous home, volunteered to reveal the finest lunch locations downtown. It felt amazing to have someone actually focus on what I was expressing for once. The other ladies in the workplace obviously had attractions to him, which honestly just intensified my fascination. He was unattached, amusing, and possessed this vitality that made even ordinary work discussions feel thrilling. When Marcus would inquire about my day, I'd reference Derek casually, and he'd just mumble some reply from behind his computer. He never wanted to hear specifics about my work anyway, never questioned about the individuals I was spending 8 hours daily with. So when Derek started proposing we grab beverages with the crew after work, I didn't see any justification to run every social choice past Marcus first. Those after-work gatherings became the pinnacle of my week. Derek would reserve me a spot, recall minor things I'd referenced in passing, actually laugh at my humor instead of giving me that courteous smile Marcus had mastered. I discovered myself staying later and later, not wanting these discussions to conclude and return home to Marcus's ritual of dinner, streaming shows, and dozing on the sofa by 9:30. Derek made me feel like the captivating, dynamic individual I used to be before I became just Marcus's spouse who'd relocated wherever his profession needed us to go. When Derek started messaging me outside of work, it felt organic, just humorous observations about our colleagues or articles he thought I'd find intriguing. Marcus barely glanced up from his device when my phone vibrated, completely unaware to the reality that someone actually found me worth conversing with. I started operating my own vehicle to work instead of taking public transit, informing Marcus I wanted more autonomy, more authority over my timetable. Really, I wanted the adaptability to stay out later, to grab dinner with Derek when the impulse struck, to feel impulsive for the first time in years. Marcus made some remark about being concerned about my driving, which was so characteristic of him. Always discovering something to stress about, always attempting to manage every minor risk in our existence. I'd been driving just fine for years before I met him, but suddenly he's behaving like I'm some kind of safety liability just because I wanted a little independence. His constant necessity to control and worry about everything was precisely why I needed someone like Derek in my existence. Someone who trusted me to make my own choices and didn't treat me like I was some fragile porcelain. The first time Derek and I crossed the boundary, we'd been working late on an assignment and decided to grab dinner at this little establishment downtown. The dialogue flowed so effortlessly, jumping from work to travel to our university stories, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this engaged with another individual. When he walked me to my vehicle and kissed me, it felt like awakening from a long, tedious dream. This wasn't some midlife crisis or desperate attempt to recapture my youth. This was just two individuals who genuinely enjoyed each other's presence, who made each other laugh, who had an actual connection. I drove home that night feeling more alive than I had in months. Marcus was already asleep, of course, sprawled across the couch with some documentary still playing on the television. Looking at him lying there, I felt this strange mixture of affection and disappointment. He was a decent man, stable and dependable, but when was the last time he'd made my pulse race? When was the last time we'd stayed up conversing because we were too excited about the discussion to go to sleep? I deserved to feel that kind of excitement, that kind of connection after everything I'd surrendered to build this safe, predictable existence with him. Derek and I started meeting at this hotel downtown maybe once weekly, sometimes twice if we could arrange it. It wasn't sordid or desperate like people might imagine. We'd converse for hours, really talk about literature and films and destinations we wanted to explore. He listened to my concepts about expanding our department's social media presence, took my suggestions seriously instead of just nodding along. The physical part was just one piece of this larger connection we discovered, the sense of being truly understood by another individual. Marcus never suspected anything because he was so wrapped up in his own routine. He'd ask how work was progressing, and I'd tell him about assignments and deadlines, and he'd make appropriate responses while checking his email or organizing his workspace. He never asked about Derek specifically, never seemed curious about why I was suddenly so much happier, so much more energetic when I came home. Part of me almost wished he would notice, would ask questions, would show some indication that he was paying attention to the individual he'd married. I got better at managing the logistics, at keeping my two worlds separate. Derek understood that I needed to be careful, that I wasn't ready to detonate my entire existence over what we both knew was probably temporary. He never pressured me to leave Marcus or make dramatic declarations. We were both adults who could appreciate what we had without turning it into some kind of melodrama. It was refreshing to be with someone who didn't need to analyze and complicate every emotion. The accident occurred on a Thursday evening when Derek and I were driving back from dinner at this new place he'd wanted to try. I was telling him some story about Marcus's latest home improvement project, probably being a little too animated with my hands, when this vehicle ran a red signal and slammed right into my passenger side. The impact was terrifying, this horrible crunching sound, and then everything spinning until we ended up facing the wrong direction in the middle of the intersection. Derek was fine, thank goodness, just shaken up. But he kept looking around nervously while we waited for the authorities. He had this panicked expression, like he was calculating all the ways this could get complicated. And I realized he was probably thinking about work, about how it would appear if people knew we were together. When the police officers started taking statements, Derek caught my eye and mouthed something about needing to get back to the workplace. I nodded, understanding completely. There was no justification to drag him into the insurance mess and paperwork when he hadn't even been operating the vehicle. After Derek left, I focused on handling everything with the authorities and the tow service. The other driver was clearly at fault, and the officer was sympathetic and efficient about getting all the details recorded. Pause. I called Marcus to let him know what happened, and he immediately went into crisis management mode, asking if I was injured, if I needed him to come retrieve me, whether I'd called our insurance company yet. His concern was sweet, but also exhausting. I just wanted to process what had happened without turning it into this huge, dramatic emergency. When I arrived home that night, Marcus was waiting with tea and this worried expression that made me feel guilty for being annoyed with his huffering. He kept asking questions about exactly what happened, whether the other driver seemed impaired, if I thought there might be any lasting damage to my neck or back. I told him the basic facts about the intersection and the other vehicle, and he seemed satisfied with that level of detail. There was no reason to mention Derek's presence since it didn't change anything about the accident itself. Over the next few days, Marcus handled all the insurance calls and paperwork, which I appreciated since I was already stressed about the whole situation. He kept saying he was proud of how well I'd handled everything, how level-headed I'd been in a scary situation. I started to relax, figuring we'd just get the vehicle repaired and move on with our existence. Derek and I were more cautious about our meetings for a while, both of us a little rattled by how close we'd come to unnecessary complications. But then Marcus came home from picking up some police report with this strange expression I'd never seen before. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and asked if there were any details about the accident I hadn't told him. The question caught me completely off guard because I thought we'd covered everything days ago. I asked him what he meant, whether he thought I'd been drinking or something, because honestly, that's what his tone suggested. That's when he mentioned Derek specifically. Said he knew Derek had been in the vehicle with me. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm and think clearly. Obviously, the police report must have mentioned Derek's statement or something, which meant I needed to explain why I hadn't brought him up before. I told Marcus that Derek had needed to purchase a gift for someone who was traveling, and I'd offered to drive him since it was on my route home from work anyway. The accident happened on our way back, and Derek had to leave quickly to deliver the gift and get back to the workplace. Marcus listened to this explanation with that same weird, intense expression, asking a few follow-up questions about timing and logistics. I answered everything as clearly as I could, emphasizing how rushed and chaotic everything was after the accident, how Derek's quick departure was just practical given his work obligations. Marcus seemed to accept this, but something felt different about his energy for the rest of the evening. He was quieter than usual, more distant, like he was thinking about something he couldn't quite figure out. I texted Derek later to give him a heads up that Marcus knew he'd been in the vehicle with me, just in case it came up at work somehow. Derek was understanding about the whole situation, agreed that my explanation made perfect sense given the circumstances. We decided to be extra careful for a while, maybe meet less frequently until things settled down completely. It felt like we'd handled a potentially awkward situation pretty well, all things considered. But over the next week, Marcus's behavior got increasingly strange. He'd ask random questions about my work schedule, about which assignments I was collaborating with different people. He started paying attention when my phone buzzed, looking up from his laptop with this curious expression, like he was trying to piece together some puzzle. I began to wonder if the accident had somehow triggered some kind of paranoid phase, like he was suddenly worried about all the things that could go wrong in our carefully ordered existence. The weirdest part was how he started being extra affectionate, suggesting we plan a weekend trip or try that new restaurant I'd mentioned months ago. It was like he was suddenly trying to reconnect after years of just coexisting in our comfortable routine. Part of me appreciated the effort, but it also felt awkward given everything else that was occurring. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, but I also wasn't ready to surrender the excitement and connection I'd discovered with Derek. Then, one evening, Marcus came home and sat me down with this serious expression that made my stomach drop. He looked me straight in the eyes and said he knew I'd been sleeping with Derek for a long time. Just like that, no buildup, no careful questioning. My first instinct was to deny everything, but something in his face told me he wasn't guessing or fishing for information. He knew. Somehow, he actually knew. And I found myself scrambling to figure out how much he knew and what I could say to minimize the damage. I told him it wasn't supposed to last that long, that it had started as just a friendship that got complicated. I tried to explain that it was just a little excitement, something that had nothing to do with our marriage or how I felt about him. Marcus listened to all of this without changing his expression, like he was waiting for me to finish so he could move on to whatever came next. I kept talking, telling him that what Derek and I had was never as good as what we had together, that it was a horrible mistake I'd been trying to figure out how to end, but nothing I said seemed to register with him. He just sat there with this cold, distant look I'd never seen before. Finally, he stood up and told me to pack whatever I could fit in a suitcase and be out of the house in 15 minutes. My first instinct was to deny everything, but something in his face told me he wasn't guessing or fishing for information. He knew. Somehow, he actually knew, and I found myself scrambling to figure out how much he knew and what I could say to minimize the damage. I told him it wasn't supposed to last that long, that it had started as just a friendship that got complicated. I tried to explain that it was just a little excitement, something that had nothing to do with our marriage or how I felt about him. Marcus listened to all of this without changing his expression, like he was waiting for me to finish so he could move on to whatever came next. I kept talking, telling him that what Derek and I had was never as good as what we had together, that it was a horrible mistake I'd been trying to figure out how to end. But nothing I said seemed to register with him. He just sat there with this cold, distant look I'd never seen before. Finally, he stood up and told me to pack whatever I could fit in a suitcase and be out of the house in 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Like I was some kind of stranger he was evicting, not his spouse of 8 years. I tried to argue, to explain that we could work through this if he'd just give us a chance to talk it through properly, but he was completely unmovable, checking his watch and telling me I now had 14 minutes. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's existence fall apart. I threw clothes and toiletries into a bag while Marcus stood in the doorway, making sure I didn't take anything he considered his. 12 years together, and he was treating me like a criminal who couldn't be trusted alone in our own house. I kept thinking he'd come to his senses, realize he was destroying our entire relationship over something that didn't even threaten what we had together. But he didn't soften, didn't show any sign of the man who'd been worried about my safety just weeks earlier. When my 15 minutes were up, he walked me to the door and told me not to contact him except through lawyers. The coldness in his voice was more shocking than anything else that had happened. This wasn't the Marcus I'd married, the man who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings and worry about whether I was wearing enough layers in winter. I ended up staying with my friend Jessica that first night, trying to process what had just happened. Jessica was supportive but clearly shocked by the whole situation. She kept asking if there was any way to fix things, whether Marcus might calm down after a few days and be willing to talk. I found myself getting frustrated with her questions because she didn't understand how unreasonable he was being, how he'd completely overreacted to something that didn't even affect our day-to-day existence. A few days later, someone showed up at my workplace with divorce papers, right there in front of my colleagues, like Marcus was deliberately trying to humiliate me. I could feel everyone staring as I signed for the envelope, probably wondering what kind of drama I'd brought into their professional environment. It was mortifying and completely unnecessary. Just Marcus's way of punishing me for finding happiness somewhere he couldn't control. But that wasn't even the worst part. Apparently, Marcus had also contacted my supervisor, told him about my relationship with Derek, made it sound like we'd been conducting some kind of inappropriate workplace affair on company time. My supervisor called Derek and me into his office that same afternoon with this disappointed expression, like we were teenagers who'd been caught passing notes in class. He explained that while he understood these things happened, the company couldn't have employees using work time and resources for personal relationships. Both Derek and I were being let go, effective immediately, with 2-week severance and a recommendation that we keep the situation off our references. Derek looked as stunned as I felt. We'd been careful, professional, never let our personal connection interfere with our work quality or team dynamics. Walking out of that office with my belongings in a cardboard box was one of the most humiliating experiences of my existence. My colleagues tried to be supportive, but I could see the curiosity and judgment in their faces. Marcus had managed to destroy not just our marriage, but also my career, my financial independence, my entire professional reputation. All because he couldn't handle the fact that I'd found someone who appreciated parts of me he'd never even noticed. That evening, I drove to our house, furious and hurt, needing to make Marcus understand what his vindictive behavior was costing both of us. But when I rang the doorbell, he answered with that same cold expression and told me I had no business being there. I tried to explain how unfair he was being, how he destroyed my livelihood over his own insecurity and jealousy. His response was to threaten to call the authorities if I didn't leave immediately. Something inside me snapped at that moment. I grabbed the potted plant from his front porch and threw it as hard as I could at his living room window. The crash was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected, like finally getting to express how furious I was at his self-righteous attitude. He stood there staring at the broken glass with this shocked expression, like he couldn't believe I was capable of that kind of reaction. I told him he deserved that and worse after what he'd done to my career, my reputation, my entire existence. I dared him to call the authorities, to add even more drama to the situation he'd already blown completely out of proportion. But he just went inside and closed the door, leaving me standing there in his driveway feeling simultaneously vindicated and empty. A few days later, I found out he'd actually followed through on calling the authorities about the window. I also discovered that someone had keyed his vehicle in the parking lot at his workplace, which he'd naturally assumed was me and reported that too. The police officer who called was polite but firm about how these kinds of domestic disputes needed to be handled through proper legal channels, not through property damage and retaliation. The worst part was watching Marcus share his version of events with our mutual friends and family members. He painted this picture of himself as the innocent victim and me as some kind of unstable cheater who'd been living a double existence. People who'd known me for years started treating me differently, like they were seeing me clearly for the first time, and didn't like what they discovered. My parents were particularly disappointing in their response. I'd expected them to be upset, but I thought they'd also understand that marriages are complicated, that sometimes people grow apart and find connections elsewhere. Instead, they acted like I'd committed some unforgivable betrayal, like the daughter they'd raised was incapable of the kind of behavior Marcus was describing. Even my closest friends seemed unsure how to navigate the situation. They wanted to be supportive, but they also couldn't hide their shock at how everything had unfolded. Jessica kept asking questions about timeline and details that made me feel like I was being cross-examined rather than comforted. Everyone seemed to think there was some crucial piece of information they were missing, some explanation that would make my choices make sense to them. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Marcus's lawyer had somehow gathered an impressive amount of evidence about my relationship with Derek, including photos and receipts and documentation I hadn't even known existed. My lawyer explained that adultery cases were often difficult to navigate, but the level of proof Marcus had assembled was unusually thorough and damaging to any claims I might make about marital assets. In the end, I walked away from 12 years of marriage with basically nothing. Marcus kept the house, the savings account, even the vehicle since it was technically in his name for insurance purposes. I was starting over at 35 with no job, no home, no financial security, and a reputation that made finding new employment in my field nearly impossible. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving in his newfound single existence. Mutual friends would mention seeing him at restaurants or events, looking relaxed and happy in a way they claimed they hadn't seen in years. According to Jessica, he'd told someone at a party that he felt immensely happy to be divorced, like he'd been freed from some burden he'd been carrying without realizing it. That characterization stung more than anything else. The idea that our entire marriage had been some kind of obligation he'd been enduring, rather than a partnership he valued, made me question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. Had he been as disconnected and dissatisfied as I was, just better at hiding it? Had my relationship with Derek been less of a betrayal and more of a symptom of something that was already broken? But then I'd remember his reaction that night when he gave me 15 minutes to pack, the coldness in his voice when he told me not to contact him, the systematic way he destroyed my career and social connections. That wasn't the behavior of someone who was relieved to be free. That was the behavior of someone who wanted to punish me as thoroughly as possible for finding happiness outside the boundaries he'd set for our existence together. People just don't understand what I was going through in that marriage. How suffocating it felt to be with someone who never really saw me as a complete individual. Marcus loved the version of me that fit into his organized, predictable world. But he never showed any interest in the parts of me that wanted adventure, spontaneity, passion. Derek saw those parts of me and appreciated them, made me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Everyone acts like I destroyed our marriage for some meaningless fling. But they don't understand that what Derek and I had was real connection, real compatibility. We brought out the best in each other, challenged each other intellectually, shared the kind of chemistry that makes you feel like you're finally living your actual existence instead of just going through the motions. Marcus's vindictive response to discovering our relationship proved that he never really knew me at all. If he'd understood what I needed, what I'd been missing in our marriage, maybe we could have worked through it. Instead, he chose to destroy everything we built together along with my career and reputation, rather than take any responsibility for the ways our relationship had failed both of us. Now I'm starting over in a new city, trying to rebuild a career and a social existence from nothing. It's been harder than I expected, not just financially, but emotionally. Some days I feel angry at Marcus for being so merciless, so determined to make me pay for finding happiness somewhere else. Other days I feel sad about everything we lost, all the good years we had before things got so stagnant and predictable. But I don't regret what I had with Derek, even though it cost me everything else. For those few months, I felt like myself again, like the interesting, vibrant individual I used to be before I became just Marcus's spouse. That feeling was worth fighting for, even if nobody else understands why I made the choices I did. Sometimes you have to risk everything to find out who you really are, and I'd rather be alone and authentic than safe and invisible.